Military logistics is broken. Supply chains are slow, fragile, and brittle in contested environments. The Pentagon has poured billions into weapons, but the machinery that keeps them fueled, armed, and supplied is still running on spreadsheets. Dave Tuttle, co-founder and CEO of Rune Technologies, is taking a different path, one that builds the connective tissue that keeps it all moving. Rune's platform, TyrOS, is an AI-enabled operating system for sustainment, designed to run anywhere, even on a laptop in the field, and scale across the most complex battle spaces. Rune just raised a $24 million Series A, is working with frontline commands, and is shaping how the US military thinks about sustainment in great power competition. Today on Valley of Depth, Dave and I talk about why logistics has been overlooked for so long, how Rune is building software that soldiers actually want to use, and why the future of warfighting may hinge less on the weapons we buy and more on the systems that keep them in the fight. On to the show. World Space Business Week is coming to Paris this September from the 15th to the 19th, and it's bringing together the leaders of the global space economy. For 5 days, executives, investors, governments, and agencies meet for strategy, partnerships, and major announcements. If you want to be where space business gets done, this is it. I'll definitely be there. Register at WSBW.com or visit nova.space for more details. Dave, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Good to be here.
So let's start with your name, Rune. I want to talk a little bit about that. I decided I'm not going to look it up. I'm not going to go explore the interwebs to figure out why you called it Rune, but I would love to know the story behind the name.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple different threads there. I mean, I think one is, as you may know, like finding a name for a company that is not already taken is rather difficult today. But also both Peter, my co-founder, and I both came from Anduril. Anduril, very much, obviously founders from Anduril really came from Palantir, and a lot of that DNA goes through. We really didn't think that the world needed a third Lord of the Rings themed name, but we did want to stay, let's say, like mythologically adjacent to it. So we kind of stayed in this Greek, Roman, Norse mythology, a lot of those names taken, and then we kind of one day defaulted on like, well, what happens if we use like runic alphabet and we choose Rune Technologies? Yep. And honestly, there's a bit of fun there with like really cool Viking swag and some cool plays we can do on that, and we lean pretty hard into the kind of the Viking theme. So. We also, the runic logo that we use is kind of a play on rado with a runic symbol, and that means like to journey or travel. And we figured for both a startup, technology company and one focused on logistics, we thought that was rather fitting there. So, both the runic rado and the Rune as a name was kind of in that area.
Awesome, makes a ton of sense. Okay, so. Tell us, you just raised a pretty decently sized Series A with some great investors, 24 million, I believe is the number. What are you building? Tell us a little bit about what you're building, and let's start there.
No, and obviously I'll say up front, super thankful for our investors and our partners on this journey. We've raised just about $30 million total. That was split between the seed round last year and our Series A this year. We are building a next generation software platform for military logistics for sustainment. We can talk about like doctrinally what that means, but Peter and I, our first thought in this company was how do we think about revolutionizing and modernizing the logistics enterprise for the military to really move at machine speed, to bring some of the technological advancements that your great software and your great defense tech companies have brought to the other warfighting functions. How do we bring that to the logistics, to the sustainment warfighting function? And how do we bring modern technology using the best practices of Silicon Valley in the commercial space, and how do we bring that to logistics? So our software platform is called TyrOS, and it really is about not just data aggregation and visualization, right? To us, those are like basement level things any half decent technology company can do. But how do we actually bring automation? How do we bring course of action generation and automation and recommendation engine type things to logisticians across, the U.S. military, the Joint Force, allied militaries, and even somewhere, outside of that to different federal agencies?
So we're going to dive into all of that. Lots to unpack there, but I want to dive into your career a little bit and how you ended up building this company. And I know you spent some time in Anduril, and then you also had a finance stint like myself. But then before that, you were in the military. So maybe tell us a little bit about like that arc and how you ended up founding the company.
Yeah. It's get ready for a little journey here. It's my background is a little weird, back and forth. But yeah, I guess starting from the first, I commissioned into the Army, spent about 4 years and change in active duty up at beautiful Fort Drum, New York with 10th Mountain Division. I actually left active duty and, like you said, ended up in the finance world, ended up as an investment banker for a couple of years covering aerospace and defense companies mainly. And then as luck would have it, I had stayed in the National Guard that whole time, and an opportunity came back to go back on active duty. Ended up down at Fort Bragg, North Carolina with the Joint Special Operations Command, and spent what I thought was going to be a short time. It ended up being just under 5 years down there, about 4.5 years in the JSOC enterprise, both on the operational side there, and then leading some software development teams. And really my time leading the software development teams within the JSOC organization there, really, I fell in love with software and what you can do with software and how you can enable operational users like I used to be with modern software, and how quickly you can build things in this day and age. And that was it was an amazing experience in uniform, both in the operational side and that software development side. And came out of that and said, hey, I really want to, if I want to go learn from the best and learn more about software and technology, then I should go to a great defense tech company that does it. And from there, I went to Anduril, spent a couple of years at Anduril where I met Peter, my co-founder. And we built out what at the time was the command and control hardware business there. How do you do integrated hardware software for command and control purposes? And really just had a phenomenal experience at Anduril. And how do you learn from these really great folks building great technology? And then from there, that's obviously, like I said, where I met Peter and some other folks, and many of our team do come from Anduril. And a little bit into like why Rune. We, like I kind of mentioned before, we kind of saw that all of this great technology effort and all of these great minds and these great efforts were being put against joint all domain command and control, right? Which is where we spent a lot of our time. But our realization was when we were talking about joint all domain command and control, JADC2 efforts, or even service level all domain command and control efforts, we were really talking about command and control, intelligence, and fires, or fighting functions. And those are critical. I'm not saying like how do we fight the force we talk about that is not critical. But what we didn't really see was that same level of technological emphasis from the private sector being put against sustainment. How do we sustain the force? How do we sustain the force, especially past the first 72 hours should a conflict phase come? And Peter and I looked at it and said, well, what happens if we bring the same level of innovation, the same level of hyper focus and speed of development and technology, if we bring that to the sustainment enterprise, right? Just like we brought to some of the other warfighting functions. And we founded Rune to do exactly that. We live, eat, breathe military logistics. That is what we do every day. That is what all of us are here to do and what we're here to build software for. And that's kind of like the story arc there. Time in uniform, time out of uniform, a little bit in the private sector, a little bit in the finance world, and kind of the sum. We are all the sum of all of our experiences, and that's all kind of collected together into what is Rune today.
So what was the conversation with Peter like day one? Like, how did you guys both know that this had to exist?
Yeah. I mean, Peter, I'll always give credit. Peter has the initial idea. He is the product visionary for this, and from a basic idea of how do we bring, again, I'll go back to how do you bring automation and automated recommendation to logisticians in the force, and in some ways parallels to previous work we did at other places. This isn't just about how do you serve up data to folks, right? It is how do you actually use machines and software to synthesize that data to provide recommendations. And kind of the basic, one of the basic conversations we had is, there is technology today that allows you to do what we call kind of automated weapon target pairing, which is the idea that if you have an enemy or an adversary target, right? Let's say that's an adversary destroyer or something, and you know where that is, and you have intelligence about that, right? And then you also know what friendly effectors you have. That may be an aircraft, that may be a surface-based fire or something, but something that can affect that adversary target. And you know the salvo tables needed to destroy that adversary target. How do you automate all of that, right? And that has happened to date. So some earlier works through Anduril and great places like that, and you can actually make that an automated weapon target pairing decision. And from there, Peter and we really looked at, well, what happens if you have the similar problem of a unit on an island in the Pacific running low on a certain class of supply? Let's say it's running low on fuel. And you have fuel in Luzon, and you have fuel in Oahu, and you have these platforms, these vessels, or these aircraft to move that thing to this location, and the time distance involved in all of that. Why is that a manual process, right? Why is a logistician having to tie all of that together to do the fundamental kind of math behind who needs what, where it needs to go, what it needs to go by, what crews do you have to move it, right? To us, that is a great machine matching problem as well. And that was kind of the fundamental little beachhead of an idea that drove us to look like, what does the logistics enterprise look today? What does technology look like for the logisticians across the force? And really discovered that, like, in many ways, and I don't mean this derisively against our logisticians at all. In fact, this should be the urgency to help them, is that in many ways, logistics has kind of been the forgotten warfighting function from a technological advancement standpoint, right? So, like, how do you bring technology to that problem set? Really
that's an interesting point. I want to talk about that for a second. So, like, do you feel like people underestimate how much wars are lost, not on the battlefield per se, but because of logistics?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think we could go through the entire historical arc of warfare and find fundamental, and there's tons of great quotes about how logistics wins wars, right? And professionals talk logistics, and pull out a few, General Patton and Third Army racing across France, right? Outran the supply lines, and the entire Allied offensive through northern France into Germany in World War II was halted because they ran out of fuel, right? And those supply lines had to catch up from the ports on the west coast of France and the Channel ports up to the Allied advance there. But I think, we can use as historical examples to bring it like closer to us in time and space. I think the fundamental difference now, where if we were having this conversation 5 years ago, 10 years ago, is the global war on terror and focused on, CENTCOM in the Middle East and Afghanistan and Iraq was a fundamentally different problem set of warfare than if we're thinking about a near peer adversary or pure adversary conflict, right? Not to say that those of us who, from the GWAT era, did not have our own challenges and it was not a hard conflict in some ways, but from a logistical standpoint, you had generally fixed bases, you knew where things had to go, you had controlled supply lanes from a strategic standpoint getting into theater. You did have somewhat of a threat moving things around the theater, but not a pure adversary threat doing that. So I think fundamentally it's a very different operational environment now when we're thinking about if a conflict should come, or how do we prepare for the worst case scenario with conflict with an adversary. And frankly, the stresses that is going to put on the logistics enterprise today. And I think, I'm sure we'll talk about this a little bit more, but all you have to do is look at the example of Ukraine-Russia, right? And look at the scale and the speed that is required of a logistics enterprise to sustain a force in a force-on-force conflict with a pure adversary, right? The scale of consumption of supplies, the scale of expenditures of munitions, right? That absolutely dwarfs anything that the U.S. military and our allies really had to face in the last 20 years or 25 years of conflict.
If we walked, let's kind of let's think kind of smaller scale for a second. Like, if you walked into like a unit today, and you watched how they manage sustainment, like what's the scene? Paint the scene.
Yeah, it's it's crazy to think about, but it's a lot of whiteboards. At best it's Excel.
Right out of the movies.
Yeah, right out of the movies. And I mean, it's no different when I think back to first deployment of mine in 2011 and 12 and tracking vehicle statuses and maintenance statuses on a whiteboard using markers. That's really like the way it still is in many ways today. And, maybe you have Excel documents that are, tracking logistics requests and supplies, and those are being sent up. But then a human, right, a non-commissioned officer or a junior officer is compiling those together, aggregating those, and then it's being sent up echelon, and someone else is then doing it. And that's how it goes every single level up the military. So I think you'd see trackers on whiteboards for equipment statuses, vehicle statuses, supply inventory numbers, munition numbers, things like that, all being tracked on analog, or at best case, like legacy digital ways that are, not smart, quote unquote, in any means of that word. And that is really the world of logistics today in the military, the tactical and the operational level, especially. When you get to the enterprise at the strategic level, you certainly do have some enterprise systems that are, somewhat modern software and some enterprise solutions there. But really, when you get to those low levels on an operational battlefield, that is still a very human-centric and very analog process today across not just the U.S. military, but all of our allied militaries.
Why has it been so outdated for so long?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple. I think back to the point of, we haven't had to innovate to meet the needs over the last 20 years of warfare, right? There was, I want to be careful that, again, hard fight and got the job done that it needed to be, but there wasn't the pressure there at the scale and the speed to drive innovation across this. There were many other threats that we had to account for with technology, I think. But I think the other important thing is generally, if you look long enough at history, you kind of see a recurring pattern of new weapon systems are fielded, new combat systems are fielded, new technologies are fielded, and then kind of lagging behind that is the modernization of the logistics tail behind those, right? And I think really, if you think about the last couple of years, we're seeing that play out, right? Autonomous vehicles are now proliferating. Right? That is a constant in the battlefield of today, seen in Ukraine and Russia. We're seeing all of those systems, which are amazing, autonomous systems and semi-autonomous systems being proliferated. Those bring with them their own logistics tail and own logistics needs. So I think if you look at over history with any new modern, technology innovation in the military, you're always going to have the logistical needs trail, a little bit further behind that. And I think this point in time is that time where we're fielded new systems, we fielded new doctrinal ways that the military is going to fight and the services are going to fight. And now the realization is, okay, we have to update the logistics enterprise to be able to do that. And the services have made, this isn't just me saying this, like the services have signaled openly that this is a priority, right? The U.S. Army has stood up the contested logistics cross-functional team only a couple of years ago, right? That is an indication that the service realizes, the Army realizes we have to modernize this. There are programmatic parts of large modernization efforts right now focused on predictive logistics and predictive maintenance and those types of things. So I think we're really in this period of time where the department writ large, the DoD writ large, and the services have made a realization that we have to do better and we have to modernize. And I think that's kind of that historical arc is part of that, and also just the change in warfare that we're seeing right now over the last really 36 months.
Yeah, no, that all makes sense. Let's talk about TyrOS for a second, which is your flagship product. Let's kind of dive in. How does it change the picture on the ground for logistics? Walk us through sort of like the kind of the user interface, how folks are using it, and how you envision it to be used in the future.
Yeah, well, I think, to set the stage here, I think at first glance, you look at the logistics enterprise and you say, hey, there's a lack of software. But actually, if you double click on that a little bit, in some cases, there is just a lack of software. So there's nothing that tracks certain classes of supply at the tactical level, right? And the military is broken up on classes of supply, class 1 through 9, mean different than class 1 being food and water, class 3 being, fuels and lubricants, class 5 munitions. That's how we think about, classes of supply. But on second glance, there's actually a lot of logistics software across the military. And what we really have found is that it's all siloed, right? It is one specific thing to do one aspect of sustainment. It is one other thing to do another thing. Those are data silos. None of those tie together. So really, as Peter and I started to explore the space early days even further, it was, how do we think about TyrOS as an orchestration layer on top of some of those things, right? So there's nothing today at the tactical and the operational levels within the US military that really provides holistic support to a logistician, because a logistician isn't just thinking about what I have on hand and what I need. It's, that he or she is thinking about what inventory do I have, what personnel do I have, what equipment do I have, what distribution assets and routes do I have, and then holistically thinking about decision making across those pillars. Really, we've built TyrOS to live on top of those and tie those together, to weave those together into a fabric to actually drive holistic decision making. And the way that manifests is, let's think about from the, kind of building from the lowest level. When you're at a company or a battery or a troop level in the Army or in the Marine Corps, right, and similar across services, and you're a company executive officer or a company supply sergeant there, and you're sending up status reports of what vehicles you have and what supplies you have and what you've consumed and what you've expended. Today, putting that into an Excel document and sending that up or hanging it on SharePoint or something like that, well, our theory is put that into TyrOS, and then TyrOS can do all kinds of algorithmic work and predictive work on top of that to actually drive decision making. And then how do we think about this in a nodal network and a mesh network across different units? And we think about this at echelon, right? So like TyrOS can work at that lowest company battery troop level in the same way that it'll work at the battalion level above that, in the same way that it'll work at the brigade or the regimental level above that, and to the division, and to the corps, and all of those. So it's about how do you aggregate data? Some of that may be automated, right, off of platforms and off of sensors as those proliferate further in the military, and we have automated ingestion of those. Some of that is going to be manual input of data, and it's going to continue to be for a little while, as you know, because we're not going to censor every single vehicle across the Army, right? That's just not going to happen anytime soon. So once you have this data, then how do you actually drive, you know, the machine speed recommendations and predictive work on top of that? How do you use AI to enable these things to happen, holistic decisions and recommendations and distribution plans and off of that? And it's not just the execution phase, right? It's not just a lot of what we think about probably goes initially to how do we move things across the battlefield and do those things. That is an important part of that. But we've also spent a lot of our time on the doctrinal planning side. So before you even cross the line of departure, before you even start executing an operation, whether that's an exercise or in real life, how do you think about the planning phase of logistics, right? Is an operation, feasible from a go, no-go criteria from a logistics standpoint? Do you have what you need on hand? Do you have the vehicles and the platforms and the munitions and the supplies on hand, right? How can we help risk decisions about an operation before it even executes, again, at echelon? And as you aggregate up those at echelon, you then start to influence strategic decision-making, especially, right, from the bottom, right? Do we have pre-positioned stocks in the right place? Do we need to reposition those? Do you have what we think about like setting the theater? Do you have the theater set in the proper way to actually support the operation you're going to do? So really this is about, you know, getting the data right at the lowest echelons, being able to proliferate that in real time or near real time, and then how do we actually drive holistic decision making off of it, which is, I think, a very differentiated approach than some other legacy companies and some other companies may approach from a top down, which I think is fundamentally flawed, right? This has to be a bottom up fix to get that expenditure and that consumption data right from the lowest echelons to then drive strategic decision making even at the highest levels.
How do you engineer the system to function on like what, you know, oftentimes are denied or degraded environments? And I'm not quoting you exactly because I don't remember exactly the quote, but and I don't think you used the language I'm about to use, but something to the effect of it'll even work on a shitty Dell laptop.
Yeah, love Dell, first of all. No, it's a great point, and I think that's the other real differentiator with how they approach this. And you know, I think, you know, Peter and the engineering team that we have built here come from these backgrounds of how do you do edge deployments of software, right? And that is architecturally drives very different decisions as we build TyrOS as a software platform, right? And I think today there's so much software out there that's built for cloud environments. And in the cloud environment, and you have infinite resources, you can spin up virtual cores, right? You have infinite connectivity, right? You have no issues with that. That is very different than the way we're approaching TyrOS, and we have built TyrOS to, like you said, how do you run it on a laptop in the jungle, in the Philippines, or in Eastern Europe, right, in a trench line with a resource-constrained environment and a bandwidth-constrained environment. So suddenly you do not have infinite resources, you do not have infinite bandwidth. And so that drives a couple different differentiators for us. The software has to be lightweight, right? It has to be able to run in those resource-constrained environments. We are certainly cloud capable. I mean, if we deploy, and we have deployed to cloud environments, we have those resources. That's great. But how do we deploy it at that low tactical echelon? And also, how do you fundamentally architect it from a data standpoint so that you're not going to count on, maybe you don't have 100 megabytes a second or 400 megabytes a second in a constant pipe of connectivity, right? From a backhaul standpoint. How do you run it on? Maybe you have an hour of 10 kilobytes a second, right? In a very thin pipe once a day. How do you think about data prioritization and the data architecture there? How do you prioritize where TyrOS is sending data to first? Probably up echelon versus across, right? What is the prioritization of the different types of data, right? Even if we think about ammunition, not every munition is created equal. We're probably going to prioritize exquisite munitions that you need to get the numbers up to first before we prioritize like 5.56 millimeter, right, small arms ammunition. So again, I think this is about we need to be not just a great technology company, we have to be deeply rooted in the doctrine of military sustainment, right? Both on the, and sustainment as a world is not just logistics, right? It's also personnel, it's also medical, right? And those sides. So how do you ground ourselves in understanding data is different, data needs to be prioritized, your pathways need to be prioritized. And then you need to be able to operate the software in a realistic environment, and it needs to be a bottom-up approach to it, not a top-down approach to it.
Yeah. I want to get back to a bit about the kind of business as a whole. Um, how are you thinking about like scaling, and what have you drawn from your experiences in Anduril? And also I'd love to kind of tie in like who's using the product right now? Who do you have it in the hands of, and what do you think that looks like over time?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I will always be extremely thankful for my time and all of our time at Anduril. I mean, it's an amazing technology company. We still have close ties there. We'll work partnered with not just Anduril, but your Palantirs of the world and many other companies. So it's, I think the mission-driven aspect, right? We are deeply a mission-driven company. I jokingly like to say, if Peter and I just wanted to make a ton of money, we would have chosen any other industry in the world than trying to sell software into the DoD. And I say that with love. I'm still actually serving as an Army National Guard officer in the part-time, so this is like deeply personal to me about how we improve and how we make sure we do the right thing. But the experience of how do you create a company that is very mission driven and very focused, because these are like life or death decisions that we are hopefully, helping our warfighters with, or helping our sustainers with. We've really focused a lot on the Army and the Marine Corps, and that's not to say that those are more important services, but it becomes a really gnarly problem when you think about it's not just sustaining a few hundred troops, right? This is about how do you sustain through modern, how do you enable sustainment through modern software of a 90,000 soldier corps or a 90,000 Marine Expeditionary Force, a MEF, a 3-star headquarters, right? That becomes a really hard problem, right? Like, how do you do this at scale? And that's been kind of our earliest partners, right? Into the Army. We've deployed into classified environments in the Army right now. We've gone through exercises with sustainers across the force. Team just came back from North Carolina last week. We were there for 2 weeks deploying, with an Army customer. I have a team out right now at 29 Palms on the Marine Corps side, doing the same thing with the Marine Corps. So this has been our earliest partners, and our earliest pilots have been into those two services. Not to say we don't have other efforts with other services, because really some of these problems are fundamental problems of how do you get that tactical level data up? How do you get real-time or near real-time feedback from the logistics standpoint from the force, whether that's talking about split squadron Air Force operation across different islands, or that's talking about an Army battalion or a Marine Corps regiment, right, doing these things. These are like universal problems, or a Navy task force or a Navy ship doing, resupply actions across, the maritime domain. But, the other interesting part about what we build, and this is kind of in building anything for the military, is you have many different user personas that you have to meet, right? So at the same time, we have to build a system that is useful for, like I said, that supply sergeant, that company XO, maybe that distribution platoon leader at the lowest tactical level. That also has to be usable in some way for a battalion S4 and a brigade S4, a regimental, and then a division G4, and then your SPO, who's actually thinking about the execution of logistics in the Army, right? And then you have to be able to inform commanders in their decision making. Those are all different pieces of this puzzle. And I like to think of it as it's like concentric circles, but then it's also slices of a pie within that. So, at your tactical level, you may have a very small concentric circle, but then you have different people involved in different pieces of that concentric circle. Then you have to build a software to go out to the next concentric circle, but also take into account that there's different pieces. Your medical logistics officer is going to care about a different piece than your maintenance control officer, or your movement control officer is a different piece, right? And then you have to expand that concentric circle out as you go up echelon, and you have to do that. So really, I think one of the reasons that this also hasn't been tackled to date is sustainment is probably the most data-driven of the warfighting functions. And it's actually a very, as we've discovered, it's a very complicated problem set to take into account all of these concentric circles and all of these different pieces of the pie and weave them together into something that is truly usable across up and down echelon and across different functions within sustainment.
Is that what has surprised you the most about starting to see the software in action? And if not, what has surprised you the most?
Yeah, I think there's been some amazing. First of all, the response we have gotten from logisticians across the force has been overwhelmingly positive, right? the response from our customers and our earliest design partners has been receptive, has been like, this is something they want. They want help to do these things, right? I think coming to them and saying, hey, we are here for you. We are here to build you the software you want. This isn't some multi-year program, and 5 years from now, we're going to build some monstrosity that maybe doesn't meet your needs. This is, hey, we're going to deploy engineers out with you in the field at an exercise, or we're going to come to your base and we're going to do these things with you and we're going to build it with you. I think that has been, to me, the most rewarding aspect of like the reception we've gotten and wanting to meet their needs and wanting the help to do it has been amazing. And I think, yeah, I mean, this is kind of like the we're all nerds on some level. So I think the fun nerd aspect is like, this is, the logistics world, it's like an onion. You peel it back and you find another data problem or you find something else and all the integration work we have to do. It's a really fun problem set to tackle. And again, my best word that I can think of is it's a gnarly problem, right? Like it's a really complicated problem set, but that's like the fun part as we dive into this and be able to do this from the data science standpoint, from the software architecture standpoint, from the environmental factors that you have to overcome about how do you actually deploy the software.
Right? Yeah, and Dave, you're gonna have to speak for yourself. I'm not a nerd. I'm kidding. I am a nerd. I'm running a business that deals with nerds all the time, so I'm with you on that.
You got to embrace it. You got to embrace it.
Exactly. So I want to talk about how is the DoD thinking about a product like this, like sort of pilot to program of record. Like where are we in that sort of like roadmap? Call it.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a couple of like ways to think about this, like the life cycle of a company, right? When you think about, as you well know, seed round, investments we got from the private capital markets, from the venture capital community is about like, can you prove product market fit? Can you prove operational need for what you're building? Can you do those things? And when we got our funding last year, it was kind of like, all right, I think it's going to take 12 to 18 months to probably do that, right? The reason we went out for our Series A when we did is we frankly hit those milestones we needed to from a product market fit and prove the need for what we were building with TyrOS within about 8 months. Like that was the reception we got, and then we got there. And now you think Series A, the funding that we've got, that this is really an execution game, right? Can we scale the team to meet the need that we've confirmed, that we've affirmed, right? Can we scale quickly? Can we keep building? Can we move faster and faster, right? Because that was always what we want to do. We want to move as fast as humanly possible, as fast as our warfighters deserve, us to move at. And I think that's been you live in, and then we can think about it a little bit from a DoD standpoint of like, different colors of money, RDT&E money and test and evaluation pilots and those types of things. But there are programmatic efforts right now, right? The Army is reinvigorating its entire mission command systems through, large programmatic efforts that have just kicked off in the last couple of months, right? The Marine Corps is revamping things. NATO next year is going to be revamping different things across the coalition force, right? So I think, you're seeing 2025 into 2026, the realization that there needs to be modernization here and there needs to be technological development is being met by programmatic efforts and new efforts for modernization there. And I think even Congress, if you look through some, testimony and things there are members of Congress that have recognized this as a need and have asked questions in open forums about what the military and the services are doing to modernize these things. And again, I'll go back to, whether it's, operational, champions that we've garnered across the joint force and even, leaders across the joint force within the logistics world, there's a recognition that like, hey, this is building what you guys are building, like a thing that is necessary and we need. And we're excited about that going forward.
What does the competitive landscape look like? Sort of think about it from like the legacy primes perspective, and then also companies like yourself, which are, just starting up.
Yeah. I mean, I think, Peter and I joked like we have every aspect you can think of in a traditional DoD world, where you have kind of your established companies that, maybe have been doing some of this. I would argue that, again, that they've really taken a top-down approach, and I think that is just fundamentally wrong. You have kind of legacy services, consulting companies that have tried to revamp themselves into software companies, which I would say that doesn't actually make you a real software company from a commercial like Silicon Valley DNA standpoint. I think that's a very big differentiator. You do have some fast followers that have since identified this. I would argue that we are further along in development and we are further along with adoption than some of those. But I would be frankly more concerned if there weren't competitors in this space, right? Like that kind of reinforces the idea that this is a need, right? And this is the military has identified this is a need and we're meeting a need. And I think one of the things you have to do is, one of the interesting parts about building for defense is how do you build something that is usable today, but also driving towards modernization of tomorrow, right? So how are you building software that can be adopted today, whether that is, across the southern border for a homeland defense mission, in an exercise, right? And how are you also building to incorporate new technologies as they evolve, whether that's autonomous vehicles, whether that's censoring type things like that, right? So you have to meet the needs today while also building towards the future. And I think that's what we are solely focused on. So yeah, there are competitors out there. That's great. They can do their thing. We will stay focused on what we need to do, which is like move fast, build great software, build intuitive software, right? I think that's the other aspect that is core to our DNA. With most of our engineering team having spent time in the commercial space before coming over to the defense space, which is, you don't need a 1,000-page manual for your iPhone when you get like iOS updates, and I don't need a new user manual for that, right? We have very smart UX UI folks who are part of our team who we fundamentally believe like TyrOS should be software that you can hand to any logistician across the military, and within minutes they can understand how to use it. They should not need a 1,000-page manual for it. And how do we just build very intuitive software to do that?
Yeah. I want to go on a quick tangent for a second. Do you think, is there, I have to assume you've thought about this, which is have you thought about sort of a future where, is Rune staying purely defense, or like, is there a world where it could power a civilian or commercial logistics?
Yeah, no, we've absolutely thought of it. I think, DoD and the military work will always be core to what we are. That's core to our values and our culture and what we're working on. I'd say there's kind of a couple layers beyond that. Like you have the U.S. DoD market. I kind of already mentioned it, that our allied nations face the same logistics challenges. So that's another layer beyond that to our partner nations out there and our partnered militaries. Beyond that, though, you also have like the non-DoD federal government space. So when you think about a Customs and Border Patrol, right, a DHS mission set, a Coast Guard mission set, right, like there's some of the same challenges there. That's kind of another layer out. And then in the pure commercial play space, think about industries that have many locations in austere environments with lots of pieces of machinery and vehicles and personnel and things like that. Comes to mind, oil and gas and mining industries, right? Those face some of the similar challenges there. A little bit unique, not so like doctrinally focused, but from an execution standpoint, similar there. So, we're not closing off any of those opportunities when we think holistically about Rune's future. I'm not saying that that's going to be in 6 months from now or 12 months from now, but like down the road, there's certainly opportunities there as well.
Got it. Okay. I want to get a little philosophical with you, if you don't mind, Dave. Let's kind of start with this, which is like, when you zoom out, you're building this technology, which is fundamentally important to the warfighter. Do you think technology like this ultimately will change doctrine itself, not just logistics workflows, but like the actual philosophy of sustainment? Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a two-way street in many ways. I think, and we can think about other examples of this where technology has driven changes in doctrine for sure, right? I mean, we want to go back in time. I mean, think about aircraft and how that changed warfare, right? Like, that's a technological innovation that fundamentally changed warfare. We can think about even what further back, indirect artillery fire fundamentally changed warfare when we think about World War I. I think technology can change, and when you think about holistic changes in doctrine and personnel and manning and structures across the military, like kind of that full .mil PF change, there's certainly a technological play in that. But I think we have to be a little careful, because we should also be building software. There should be the other direction too, which is that doctrine should influence how we are also building software. Again, to this idea of we have to build today while driving towards the future. It should not be purely technology driving doctrine, but conversely, it shouldn't just be doctrine driving technology. There should be those two gears should interplay in my mind, right? And I think the way you make sure that happens is, again, get close to the warfighters, get close to your customers, understand their challenges, understand their problems, help enable those. And by doing that, you may fundamentally change how things are happening. And to use a concrete example, right, in the logistics side, as we think about predictive logistics, right? This isn't just about what a unit needs today and where it needs it today, but is it what do they need given historical consumption and expenditures in 3 days, 4 days, 7 days, 30 days, right? That starts to change potentially how we think about positioning stocks and repositioning stocks of things globally, right? That could fundamentally change how we do that. As you get real-time feedback from the tactical layer, from the operational force on a battlefield, that may change how quickly we can sustain things and how quickly we do things. That may drive a doctrinal change in that. And likewise, as we further integrate autonomous vehicles to this vision of and I think all of us have, which is like, how do you do autonomous resupply and autonomous logistics operations, whether that's air, ground, or maritime, right? That may fundamentally change how logistics is executed and how doctrine develops for logistics. If the speed and the distributed nature of what that allows us to do may change that as well.
This next question is something anyone who's building software for the DoD has to deal with, but I'm curious your take on this, which is, how do you think about the ethics of software making resource allocation decisions in moments where lives are on the line, right? Like your example earlier with the Pacific and the different kind of allocations of fuel and where to go next, and there's effectively a piece of software making that decision, which of course, yes, there's a logistician who's then taking all that data and then helping, make that decision. But maybe what it looks like today isn't what it looks like in 10 years, which was there's just a more automated process as to how those decisions get made. How do you think about sort of that?
Yeah, I think, right now we are thinking about how do you enable the humans involved in that. And I think, for the foreseeable future, that is going to be the way it is. I don't think any of us are advocating for a Skynet-esque automated sustainment mission command system. I think that you can, the military is a unique aspect of, we're not building software that's going to necessarily replace every human in that, right? Force structures may change. How you allocate the humans within the force structure that the military has may change with technology. Great. But this is really about how do you enable humans to make faster, better informed decisions. And at the end of the day, it's still going to be a human decision, whether that is done. And there may be nuances with, when TyrOS drives recommendation 1, 2, 3 up, the machine may think through every optimization and every algorithmic thing that we do that recommendation 1 may be the better one, but the nuance that the human has, and this is where I think it's think about this as today, and we've heard this from logisticians across the force, which is logisticians are spending 80% of their time on the science of logistics and 20% on the art. We really feel like we can flip that, right? How do we allow them to spend 80% of their time on the art and only 20% on the science of it, which is maybe that second recommendation for some artistic reason, right? I hate to say that, but for some human reason is actually the better recommendation, then choose that recommendation, right? And it's about how do we enable better informed decision making in course of action generation and course of action execution.
Do you have any contrarian beliefs about defense technology that others might disagree with?
Well, I think, I'm not sure how contrarian this is because there's some other folks, but I do think right now there's a lot of emphasis in some pockets on dual use technologies and commercial technologies, right? And how we have to make something that's commercially, useful and military useful. And I'm not sure I wholly believe in that. And I'm not alone in this. Trey Stevens has some great talks about this as well, how many times we talk about, well, you have to be dual use, and it's that's only software companies or startup companies that have to be dual use, and I don't think anybody's asking Raytheon to produce dual use missiles anytime soon, right? So I think in some ways those are kind of phrases developed by the legacy established defense companies, right, that keep us kind of down and be well, you can be a dual use company, but you're not a real defense company. I'm no, I don't agree with that. I think our logisticians in the force deserve something built for them, right? And I think the unique aspects of how the military executes logistics and executes sustainment drive us to build something that is very unique to what they need to do, because like you said before, this is life or death many times. Are we getting munitions where they need to be? Are we getting supplies where they need to be? Are we getting replacements and personnel where they need to be, right? To me, that is I think we've seen a lot of failures over time of some commercial technology, and then we try to apply it into the defense space, and it really doesn't get after, again, this deeply rooted doctrinal standpoint that you have to understand how the military executes logistics operations.
Yeah, no, I actually, it's funny you say that. I very much agree with that. I think dual use is one of the most overused word in this community, and I think the two reasons, one you mentioned as to why. I think the other reason is pure, like, simply just makes it a lot easier for investors to stomach investing in a defense company when they call it dual use, and they say, oh well, there's commercial use cases for it too, but there's not. It's like, okay, well, if 90% of your market is the military, and then 10% is like some random commercial market, then I mean, yes, maybe technically you're dual use, but you're not really dual use.
That's right. And I think, we're lucky that now when we went out to the venture capital community, we're lucky to have some really deeply experienced defense tech investors, right? These our VCs, whether we're talking, from our seed round, Andreessen Horowitz and XYZ and Point72, are all deeply rooted in defense tech, and even our Series A, when we brought in Human Capital, who led our Series A, and Washington Harbor Partners, who came in, and Pax VC and Forward Deployed VC, who've been in since seed round as well, right? Are all deeply rooted and understand this defense industry and understand, frankly, the sales cycles involved and how you actually do this. Because this is quite different than selling into the commercial space. And sometimes your sales cycles are much longer, right? And your programmatic wins are much longer. So I'm lucky that we have investors who, like I say, didn't just wake up to defense tech being cool in the last
Right.
12 months, right? Have been involved in this through Anduril and through Palantir for years and understand the space and really give us the coaching and the mentorship and the partnership, but also give us the space to, and because they understand that, like, this is going to be a while, right? There's momentum to build and there's inroads to make here, and they understand it.
What milestone do you have coming up in the next year that will tell you that you guys are still on the right path?
Yeah, I mean, I think in the next year, right, there's some programmatic wins out there that are going to be great, and I think we're well placed for those, right? That's going to be, I mean, that is the milestone to get to, right? How do we get recurring revenue, and how do we get programmatic wins out there? But I think more importantly, it's how do we deploy across multiple services, right? Because out of all, again, I go back to, like, out of all the warfighting functions, sustainment really is probably one of the most joint, right? How do we do this across multiple services? Not how do we just build a great system for the Marine Corps? How do we build a great system for the Air Force or the Army or the Navy? How do we think about this from a joint force standpoint and even a coalition standpoint? So I think getting TyrOS in use with units across multiple services to us is a huge win. Because as a product company, right, we're not a services company, we're a product company. We will fold all those things into TyrOS to make sure that TyrOS is actually enabling a joint logistics enterprise, right? How do we do those things? And I think for me, that's really important. And I love, every time, I mean, it's also small ones, right? Like, I love going out to exercises. It's just out last week and the week before that, and seeing logistics users and the feedback we're getting. And, oh, what took me a week to do before, I just did in 5 minutes in TyrOS, right? That's amazing feedback. And to me, that's what keeps me going.
Yeah, that's amazing. If you guys succeed in the way you hope, what does the U.S. military look like 10 years from now compared to today?
Yeah, well, I think there's two aspects to that. I think everybody, we have this vision of, like, the tactical connected to the operational, connected to the strategic, even connected back into the defense industrial base, right? So I think in 10 years, let's use an example of an artillery battery of 155 millimeter howitzers fires rounds, and that automatically triggers some kind of production decision, back in the continental United States at a factory somewhere. To me, that's an amazing success, right? And I don't think that's technologically that is achievable today. Like, right? It's just, can we get there programmatically? Can we get there from a mindset standpoint? I believe the answer is yes, and that's what we're driving to. So I think fundamentally, how can we have that real-time feedback, even driving into whether that's manufacturing, whether that's into shipbuilding, whether that's into whatever it is in the DIB, right? I think that's one. And I think the second is the idea of autonomous resupply actions, right? So, my thesis is, before we see an autonomous fighter jet or before we see an autonomous tank, we're going to see autonomous logistics vehicles, right, cross domain. And I think if we can get to this idea and free up manpower and free up, force structure to be used against things that humans should be really doing, and we can move things autonomously across the battlefield, to me, that's a huge change. And I think we can see that in the next few years as well.
So I haven't asked this question in a while. You seem like a pretty regimented guy to me, like, kind of like really on your A game. What do you do for fun?
The Army National Guard.
I guess, there's that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think, this is, I think jokes aside, I think the mission deserves an all-consuming obsession with it, right? I really do. And I think, Peter and I both approach this as we need to put all of our effort and all of our time and our beings into doing this well. And I think, as you talk to tons of startup companies and founders, and I think that's what it takes, right? And we accept that going into it. I think that's what the mission deserves. I think that's what our customers deserve. So it doesn't leave a lot of time for outside things. I still love to get out on the ocean in any way I can, and out to the beach and sail if I get a little chance. But not a lot of room for vacations or hobbies right now in our lives, which is
well, I'm sure your shareholders love to hear what you just said. So, Dave, thanks so much for being with us. This is great. This is super interesting to hear about your company and your vision. And yeah, it sounds like you got a really great plan going. So, can't wait to have you guys back on the show in the future.
I appreciate it, Mo. No, this has been awesome. And yeah, I look forward to coming back, hopefully, sometime soon.
Yep. Until next time.
Thanks so much.